moment with Brian. He's always doing something to make me laugh, or I'm doing something to make him.
Members, her anger hardened into resolve, and the final straw came after one of her most terrifying health scares, when she was placed on life support, and while her family feared she would not survive, TLC cameras rolled, capturing every agonizing moment for the season, and Tammy later told confidants that she believed the producers were more concerned with whether they had enough footage than with her safety, and it was in the aftermath of this trauma that she began quietly plotting her exit. Though the contract still loomed over her, but she was tired of being disposable, tired of being humiliated, tired of seeing herself turned into a monster for profit while she received only crumbs, and so, armed with documentation and fury, she prepared for a confrontation that would shake her relationship with TLC to the core, and when the moment came it was not in front of cameras but in a Nashville conference room, a sterile setting with a long wooden table separating her from the executives, who had once promised her a better future, and though they expected another one of her outbursts, something they could dismiss as Tammy being Tammy, what they encountered instead was a calculated offensive, as she threw a folder thick with notes, contracts, and mismatched pay stubs onto the table, her voice cutting sharp as she demanded answers, and as executives shifted uncomfortably, tugging at ties and clearing throats, it became clear that this was not the fiery but impulsive woman they thought they could control but someone ready to wage war, and in that moment, she transformed from a pawn of reality TV into a challenger of the very system that had exploited her, and friends later described it as watching David hurl a stone at Goliath, except this time David had gathered months' worth of ammunition, proof of episodes filmed but uncounted toward pay, mysterious deductions no one could explain, and disparities between promised salaries and delivered checks, and though executives tried to deflect, to minimize, to suggest misunderstandings, Tammy did not back down, reminding them that they had built an empire off her life, her pain, her family, and that she would no longer allow herself to be treated as disposable. And while the outcome of that battle would continue to ripple in the months that followed, what mattered in that room was that Tammy finally claimed power, finally refused to be silenced, and in doing so lit the spark of a scandal that exposed not just her own mistreatment but the darker mechanics of reality television itself, a world where vulnerable people's lives are commodified, their dignity sacrificed for profit, and where networks hide behind contracts while stars are left to endure not only financial exploitation but the psychological toll of being consumed as entertainment. And as Tammy walked away from that conference room, from TLC, and from the show that had once promised hope, she knew the road ahead would be difficult, her health still fragile, her reputation still tangled in the narrative TLC had built around her, but she also knew she was free, and for the first time in years, she was no longer just a character in someone else's story but the author of her own, determined to show the world the Tammy Slayton beyond the edits, beyond the drama, beyond the spectacle, a woman who had survived judgment, poverty, addiction, betrayal, and exploitation, and who was finally ready to demand the respect she had always deserved. Tammy Slayton never asked for the kind of spotlight that would one day consume her entire world, a spotlight that turned her private battles into public entertainment and eventually led to the eruption of a salary scandal so shocking that it forced her to cut all ties with TLC and the reality show that had once promised her hope, understanding, and a chance to share her truth on her own terms, yet instead delivered betrayal, exploitation, and the crushing realization that she was worth more to the network as a spectacle than as a human being, and in order to understand how things reached this point one has to start much earlier, back in Dixon, Kentucky, where Tammy was born and where her life was shaped by poverty, health complications, family struggles, and the quiet but heavy weight of judgment that seemed to follow her everywhere, because long before the cameras arrived she had already endured years of ridicule, hospital visits, and battles with food addiction that left her isolated and unsure whether she would ever be seen for who she really was, and when TLC first approached her with the idea of £1,000 Sisters, she was torn between skepticism and hope, cynical about the way reality TV could twist lives yet also desperate for a platform that might finally let her reclaim her narrative, and she listened as producers painted rosy pictures of a show about love, family, and overcoming obstacles, a documentary-style journey that could inspire viewers struggling with weight, food, and self-image, and for Tammy, this sounded like redemption, like maybe the people who had judged her all her life could finally understand what it felt like to walk in her shoes, but she was not prepared for the way TLC cameras would cut, splice, and shape reality, How they would transform her existence into a drama wrapped up in cliffhanger and shocking twists, because networks do not simply record life, they package it into consumable products, and very quickly Tammy realized. She was no longer simply Tammy but a character, the spark plug of the show, the sister people could not look away from, and while Amy was often framed as the light-hearted, funny, sometimes clumsy balance, Tammy was portrayed as volatile, stubborn, and dramatic, which made for fantastic ratings but chipped away at her dignity, and though viewers were captivated, some mocking her while others defended her, what mattered most to TLC executives was that everyone was talking, everyone was watching. And the numbers were climbing, and yet while Tammy's face dominated advertisements and her meltdowns fueled memes and viral clips across social media platforms, behind the scenes she was earning pennies compared to the millions TLC raked in through ads, streaming, and international distribution, with early reports suggesting she and Amy earned as little as $1,000 to $1,500 per episode, an insulting figure when contrasted with how much revenue the network generated from their pain, and for Tammy. This was not just about money but about respect, about whether the life she laid bare on screen, exposing her most vulnerable moments, her health scares, her tears and tantrums, was worth more than crumbs, as she reportedly told friends, and for a while she convinced herself to endure, telling herself that persistence would eventually lead to a raise, to more honest storytelling, to recognition. But instead the opposite happened, because as seasons progressed, her health deteriorated further. Hospitalizations became part of the plot, her very survival became a ratings hook, and each emergency that terrified her family was transformed into a shocking cliffhanger for audiences at home, and when she asked for breaks to focus on her recovery, executives resisted, reminding her that momentum could not be lost, that viewers wanted the real Tammy, though the Tammy they wanted was a version edited for maximum drama, not the woman who laughed with her nephews or tried quietly to improve. Because those moments rarely made it past the cutting room floor, replaced instead with screaming matches, tears, refusals, and scenes that painted her as perpetually angry, stubborn, or hopeless, and this editing created a cycle where viewers' harshest judgments were reinforced, and the flood of online bullying became overwhelming, with strangers ridiculing her weight, intelligence, relationships, and worth as a human being, while TLC executives seemed satisfied so long as ratings remained high, and trapped under a multi-season contract that made leaving nearly impossible without financial penalties or lawsuits, Tammy felt like a prisoner of her own life, her suffering broadcast for the world with little compensation in return, her resentment growing as she realized that no matter how much she gave, the network only wanted more chaos, more conflict, more Tammy the spectacle and less Tammy the person, and by the time season 3 rolled around, she was no longer just a reality star but a cultural flashpoint, a name that sparked debates across Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok, with some calling her toxic and others calling her exploited, but either way she was being talked about constantly, her life dissected frame by frame, her behavior endlessly analyzed, and TLC leaned into the controversy, deliberately encouraging situations that would heighten drama, because messy reality meant more viewers and more ad dollars, and yet Tammy's bank account did not reflect any of that. With whispers beginning to circulate that not only were her paychecks small but they were being manipulated, reduced, or withheld, and when she compared her contracts to the actual deposits, she began to suspect she was being shortchanged, and though she initially dismissed these concerns, once she started collecting evidence, bank records, discrepancies, text messages from producers, even rumors whispered by sympathetic crew. Tammy Slayton sat in the fluorescent-lit conference room, her hands clenched tightly in front of her, the weight of years of humiliation and exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders, yet this time her exhaustion was not physical but emotional, born from the gnawing realization that the network she had trusted, the network that had filmed her at her lowest and profited from her tears, had treated her like a disposable product rather than a human being, and when she raised her trembling voice against the executives who sat across the table in their polished suits with their perfectly rehearsed lines about complicated accounting and television being messy, she knew this moment would not be like the others, for this time she was no longer begging for approval or pleading for help but instead demanding justice, and when she cried out that they had made millions off her suffering while leaving her to scrape by with scraps, the air shifted as though even the walls of that sterile room recognized the truth vibrating in her words, because she was not wrong, and the silence that followed was heavier than any insult or dismissal she had endured before, for the people who had grown rich from her pain could not deny the numbers on their balance sheets, even if they tried to smother them beneath jargon and promises. The executives leaned back in their chairs, masks slipping for just a moment, because here was the star they had packaged, edited, and sold to millions, no longer playing the role of the tragic patient or the volatile sister but a woman reclaiming her power, and when she told them she was finished being their puppet, the words did not sound like a threat but a sentence, final and unshakable, and with that she stood, her body still aching from years of illness yet her presence towering over them. As if she were suddenly unbreakable, and when she walked out of the room, the sound of the door shutting was like the crack of thunder announcing a storm that could not be contained. Behind her, the executives sat stunned, scrambling already in whispers to determine how to limit the damage, because they knew the show was built on Tammy, that without her tears and her fights and her survival, they had no ratings magnet, no lightning rod, and worse, they knew she had the power to destroy them with words alone, because the audience had watched her cry, collapse, nearly die, and fight her way back, and if she told those millions of viewers that TLC had exploited her suffering, while refusing to compensate her fairly, the people would believe her more than they would ever believe corporate press releases crafted in damage control meetings. News began to trickle out almost immediately, first as whispers in the corners of social media where fans traded rumors and then as louder leaks from insiders who could no longer bear to stay quiet, and soon the narrative shifted from idle gossip to a rolling scandal as publications picked up the story, confirming that Tammy's accusations were not empty rage but grounded in years of manipulative contracts, withheld payments, and a system designed to exploit her vulnerability, and hashtags. Demanding justice for Tammy trended as comment sections exploded with fury, some from longtime supporters who had always suspected the network of cruelty, and others from former critics who now saw her not as a villain of reality TV but as a victim of a corporation that had preyed on her weakest moments for profit. Even those who had once mocked her weight, her temper, her stubbornness now rallied behind her, because the story was no longer about her flaws but about the imbalance of power between a struggling woman and a multimillion-dollar network, and in that shift, Tammy found the strength to keep speaking, because she realized her pain had never been private, it had been broadcast, dissected, monetized, and now she could use that same visibility to tell her side. At first, though, the high of defiance gave way to a crash when Tammy sat in her car away from the cameras and let the tears come, years of humiliation flooding out as sobs that shook her body, for she was grieving not just the betrayal but the lost years, the times she had believed she had no choice, that she had to perform suffering for survival, that her body and her dignity were bargaining chips for small paychecks and fleeting fame, and yet even in the grief there was freedom, because these tears were no longer filmed for ratings or edited into dramatic music montages, they were hers alone, a private release of pain that finally belonged to her, and when she wiped her face, she knew she had chosen the harder road but also the right one. When she told her family, the reactions were mixed, for Amy, who had been by her side since the beginning, understood the anger yet feared the consequences, pointing out that TLC had given them a platform they never would have had otherwise, that walking away might mean financial ruin, lost security, and the collapse of everything they had worked for, but Chris stood firmly by Tammy, reminding her that no amount of money justified exploitation and that she had every right to stand up for herself, while Amanda and Misty added their voices in support, declaring that Tammy had never been given what she deserved and that if the show ended, so be it, because their sister's dignity mattered more than ratings. Yet beneath the solidarity there was tension, for everyone knew Tammy's decision was not just a resignation but a declaration of war against one of the most powerful reality TV networks in the world, and TLC was not known for forgiving or forgetting. Inside the corporate offices, the response was immediate and frenzied, with damage control teams assembling overnight, lawyers drafting strategies, and publicists preparing statements should Tammy take her accusations public, though the first priority was not to admit fault but to silence her, and leaked reports suggested that offers were made of lump sum payouts in exchange for non-disclosure agreements, attempts to purchase her silence with hush money, but Tammy refused outright, saying this was not about money anymore but about truth, that no sum could undo the years of manipulation, the twisted portrayals, the denied payments, or the loneliness of bearing the consequences of a show that nearly killed her while enriching others. And as she began speaking more openly to friends, family, and trusted fans, her anger sharpened into resolve, her words echoing like sparks in the dark, declaring that the network had thought she was too weak, too sick, too desperate to fight back, but they had underestimated her, For the fire inside her burned brighter than their contracts, and she would rather lose everything than let them win, and as those words spread, whispered first in private circles and then repeated publicly, her battle transformed from a personal rebellion into a public scandal, unstoppable in its momentum. Behind the scenes, executives debated whether to smear her reputation, to leak unflattering stories to tabloids, to paint her once more as unstable, ungrateful, difficult. But this time the old strategies failed, for the public had already shifted, and every attempt to undermine her only deepened suspicion of the network's cruelty. Fans pointed out that they had watched her nearly die on television, that they had cried with her and prayed for her, that they knew her humanity in ways no press release could erase, and so when Tammy spoke, they listened, and when TLC tried to spin, they resisted, and the power dynamics began to tilt. The network feared that Tammy might inspire others, that more reality stars might come forward with their own stories of underpayment and exploitation, that what began as one woman's outrage could snowball into a reckoning, and so they scrambled harder, but their panic only made the cracks in their facade more visible. For Tammy, the fight was not without cost, for the stress weighed heavily on her, the backlash from certain corners of the internet stung, and the uncertainty of what came next loomed like a shadow, yet she held to the knowledge that for the first time in years, she was steering her own story rather than being edited into a caricature, and that sense of agency was worth more than any paycheck. She began to imagine what life could look like beyond TLC, perhaps telling her story on her own terms, perhaps writing a memoir or speaking directly to fans without producers dictating her every move, and in those imaginings she found a strange peace, because even though the road ahead was unclear, it was hers to walk. And as the weeks turned into months, the scandal did not fade but deepened, investigations into reality TV contracts gained traction, journalists dug into patterns of underpayment, and Tammy's name remained at the center, not as a punchline but as a catalyst, a woman who had dared to challenge a giant and refused to be silenced. The battle scarred her, yes, but it also liberated her, and while TLC's walls still trembled from the earthquake she unleashed, Tammy stood outside them, breathing freely for perhaps the first time, no longer a puppet dancing for ratings but a survivor writing her own ending, and though the fight was far from over, she knew one thing with certainty: she would never again let anyone profit from her pain without her consent, for her story belonged to her now, and she would tell it in her own voice, on her own terms, no matter how long it took or how hard the journey became.